I should acknowledge that the plans for this event have changed a few times due to COVID restrictions. What was meant to be an event for Christmas Hills Landcare members in person that would have been limited to a maximum of 70 people is now reaching over 200 people from much further afield due to the much appreciated support of Nillumbik Shire Council, who are hosting us on their Zoom platform. And also with support from the Nillumbik Landcare facilitator, Ash Densham, who's keeping all the buttons tweaked in the background. And there he is there. Thanks, Ash. Very quickly, Christmas Hills Landcare Group. Our aim is to help Christmas Hills landholders protect and sustain the environmental assets on their properties and to connect with each other and to connect with the Wurundjeri people as well. So sort of trying to learn from everybody. Current membership manages around 40 properties covering over 700 hectares, and the group supports them through projects and through learning and socialising events, not unlike this one. The thinking behind this event is that cleared rural land in Christmas Hills has limitations for the more traditional agriculture and farming practices that have arrived post-settlement, primarily due to the terrain and the soils. It's very hilly and the soils are quite thin. So we were wondering whether Aboriginal agricultural practices and or produce might provide options better suited to this land and climate. To help answer this, we've invited Bruce Pascoe to share his knowledge and understanding of Aboriginal agriculture, the range of produce and methods it involved, and what opportunities he thinks might exist here in Christmas Hills for reinstating Aboriginal agriculture, including partnering with Wurundjeri. So, Bruce Pascoe is a Yuin, Bunurong and Tasmanian man and lives on a farm on Wollagara in Yuin country. He's published 37 books, and Dark Emu Agricultural Accident won the New South Wales Premier's Award. Young Dark Emu won the Children's Book of the Year Award in 2021. I'm now going to hand over to Bruce Pascoe. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Doug. I'd like to acknowledge everyone's land, wherever people are. I'm on the Yuin land here, on the banks of the Wollagara River, and this is Yuin land, and I'm proud to be here. But I do want to acknowledge Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land and all the families there that have been there forever. This was, yesterday was an incredibly important day for Australia. I think perhaps one of our most important days, because on the front page of the Australian, there was a report about an enormous social network of people that had been going on for thousands of years. And those people were mining grindstones to grind grain into flour. And the importance of yesterday was because it was on the front page of the Australian. It was written by a white man. So instead of being told by an Aboriginal man, Australia can now feel comfortable that this information is being relayed by a white man. Very important day for Australia, because it's very, very difficult now to deride the knowledge of an Aboriginal person or to infer that it is bogus. So yesterday I thought was just an incredible day. An incredible day for Australian history, but also an incredible day for Australian social development and Australian environmental management. The Mythica people from around the borders of New South Wales, South Australia, Queensland, had been cutting grinding stone blanks out of several quarries. And they had been trading those blanks across a wide range on the Bitchery trail, trading for other products, but also trading for social interaction, dance, music, song, story, also food, bitchery, and flower. And some of the flowers that were ground on those stones were fish flour, something that we don't seem to use today. Although when I went to school, I used to have Peck's fish paste sandwiches every day. This fish flour is a similar product. And what it's telling us is about what Australia can produce and how it can produce us. So those old people in Mythica country were in a hub of trade and culture and were able to do it for thousands of years. The habitations of those people are now being examined, and I know for a fact that just to the west there's an enormous housing complex which has never been studied archaeologically. And here we are in 2021, about to go into 2022, and some of the biggest villages and the oldest in this country remain unstudied. And this is affecting us so deeply. It is why our government today is feeling so proud about thinking about net zero carbon emissions. Because if we had been in any way conscious of what the old people were doing, of the old economy, the old society, the old culture, and how that had adapted to this continent, we wouldn't be bragging about thinking about net zero emissions. So yesterday for me was such a profound day because I could see that Australia might begin to lift their eyes, take them off the front page of whatever newspaper it was and lift their eyes and start looking at country, start being aware of what grows here, what wants to grow here. You know, a farmer once said to me, we spend millions of dollars killing what wants to grow in this country so that we can grow what doesn't want to grow in this country. And it seemed to be a great metaphor for Australian agriculture. We're growing plants that we're familiar with from the Northern Hemisphere because we respect the Northern Hemisphere. We still respect the Queen. We worry about her children and her grandchildren. We worry about her dogs and her horses, but we don't worry about our own country. We have to start becoming intimate with our country. We have to know her orchids. We have to know her water. We want to have to lay down our lives for the water in our country. The things that Bunurong people said to the first Europeans to arrive at Port Phillip Bay was, why do you shit in the river? It wasn't a cheeky remark, it was profound. Why do you shit in the river? Because Aboriginal people around Port Phillip couldn't understand why you would foul water. And we still do it today. Our tanneries, our wool cleaning mills in Richmond and Collingwood around the colonial period were all pumping effluent into the Yarra, the Maribyrnong, and both Aboriginal names. And so the people wanted to know, why are you shitting in the river? Why would you do that? And it's something that Western society has to look at. So I'm celebrating yesterday that on the front page of Rupert Murdoch's Australian, there was an article about the mythical people and their production of flour. Those grinding dishes were made to produce flour, a major trading item. We know that Aboriginal people in Australia were producing flour 65,000 years ago because of another grinding dish found in Kakadu 4 years ago. 65,000 years is way beyond flour production in any other country. This is a mighty leap forward in human development, and yet it's not celebrated here. We'll bend over backwards to say that this didn't happen. So yesterday, when those grinding dishes were made apparent on the front page of the Australian, all that's over. We can't use that argument again to deny Aboriginal experience, Aboriginal wisdom, Aboriginal hard work. It can't be used again. It was a mighty day. But there's more to come, because at this time of the year, if you walk around in the bush, you'll see yam daisy. I know that Doug Evans has a slide showing a yam daisy, a murnong. But everyone's excited about murnong now because we've started talking about it. But where is the white orchid? The Diurus fragrantissima that used to be the most obvious plant in Victoria. People used to collect bundles of this orchid around Melbourne for their sweethearts because it was so fragrant, because it was so beautiful. They would collect it for their sweethearts. It was a romantic bloom. But it was also Aboriginal food. It was a crop. How come you have an orchid, which is the dominant species in a place with eucalypts and wattle? How come the volcanic plains of Victoria, reaching right to Melbourne's outskirts, weren't covered in eucalypts and wattles? They were covered in a romantic bloom because it was Aboriginal food. And that plant is now reduced to 12 individuals. They grow at the back of an industrial estate in Melbourne, and they are preserved by a group of enthusiastic white people. And as far as I can tell from the reports I've read, Aboriginal people are not involved. And I have been speaking to Dave Wandon about this plant because I would like Wurundjeri, Bunurong, Wadawurrung people to assert their cultural authority on this plant. It is their right to do so, and to bring it back so that it is again the dominant plant of the surrounds of Melbourne and not reduced to 12 individual plants. I want school children to grow it. I want households to grow it, not just for its beauty, but also for its nutrition. Apparently, it is delicious, and apparently it is very productive, and yet the introduction of sheep, fertilisers and housing estates mean it's now reduced to 12 individual plants. You know, we've got a bird as one of our mottos. We should have this orchid there. We should have the yam daisy, the murnong. But we seem to be so short-sighted that the demise of this plant doesn't seem to affect us. You know, that report was in The Age, I think it was last year, or 2019. And I expected it to be met with so much excitement, but it was kind of met with a shrug of the shoulders. We're going to have to do better than this if we, calling ourselves people caring for land. We have to do better than this. We don't, of course we're there to care for the land and get rid of weeds and things like that, but where is the orchid they called snow in the paddocks? The Europeans call it snow in the paddocks. Lovers would gather heaps of it in their arms. And in fact, someone's still doing it, because the year before that report turned up in the Age, every flower from those orchids had been picked by somebody, probably because it was pretty, probably because it was perfumed, and probably because the person was completely ignorant about how important that plant was. In talking about Murnong, one year I travelled to Portland because people told me there were Murnong in Portland. I live at Mallacoota, 6 hours from Melbourne. Portland's another 4 or 5. So I travelled to Portland from there, 11 hours, and what I saw was South African daisy. That was a beautiful, lovely person who asked me to go and have a look at that plant for her. I respect that person entirely. Very, very keen, she and her father. But they were looking at capeweed. Such is our ignorance of Australian vegetation and vegetables that we can't tell it from Cape daisy. And my son was growing a paddock of Murnong, and a volunteer from his community garden ran the lawnmower through it because he thought it was Cape daisy. Such is our ignorance of our own Australian plants that we treat them like weeds. So while yesterday was a brilliant day, I thought, God, there's a long way to go. And I'm afraid all you people watching today, you're the warriors for this. We can't do it without you. And I know from my own community here how much time non-Aboriginal people put into pulling weeds and looking after country, but we're asking more of you. I'm not asking. My community isn't asking you. Mother Earth is asking you. Mother Earth is wanting you to know how much she needs your help. So that's what land care is really all about. It's not a feather in the cap. It's simply our obligation as humans to care for our mother. Anyway, Doug, over to you, eh?
Thanks, Bruce.
Because if you don't interrupt me, I'll just keep talking all night. Because I haven't mentioned chocolate lily, and I haven't mentioned, vanilla lily, and all these, and bulbine lily. There's so much to talk about, and half the plants that our old people ate in the bush, we don't even talk about. And the more we learn, and we've got 4 Yuin people working on the farm, the more we learn, the more ignorant we feel. But we do feel the obligation of continuing this search and this care. Most of all, it's care.
So Bruce, what things do you think lend themselves best for somewhere like Christmas Hills? I mean, you've had some experience with some things where you are in East Gippsland. So, and there's obviously the plant side of it, but there's also the fauna side of it as well. So I don't know what your thoughts are and what the prospects for, I guess, what might be realistic for to be able to do something real in Christmas Hills?
Well, you've got to have a really good relationship with your shire. You've got to have a really good relationship with the CFA, because they have huge control over what you can do. I don't want to make it sound too bleak, but it's really difficult to be able to do the things that need to be done given the controls that both those organisations have over the bush, because this is seen as our current rules from the CFA and the Shire are based in good faith on what people know now. So using Roundup on the roadsides and things like that is seen as good common sense. But out at the farm here, and this is something that's going to happen everywhere in all the different forests of Australia, is that we, at the farm, we're starting to thin out a forest. People think we're mad. People think we're hating the bush. But the farm has been logged 3 times since 1880. So what has accrued now is a forest of matchsticks, and that was what caused our fire during 2019, 2020 down here, which was devastating. I was in town on Friday night. I met a couple of people I haven't met since the fires, and all they could talk about was fire. All they could talk about was losing their house, getting their dog in the car. And we knew that fire was coming, and we knew where it was coming from. It was coming from commercial forests and national park. Now, people are very keen to jump on the back of national park, but we've taught national park to treat this logged forest as if it was pristine. There's very little pristine forest in Australia. And it's no longer pristine because Aboriginal people are not there, are burning. So on our farm, we're trying to thin the forest, promote the bigger trees, and get the grassland and the tubers coming on underneath. It'll be a different forest. And I've got friends in Monoculture who will be absolutely devastated because we're talking about a forest that they never saw. They grew up with a forest they thought was wilderness, and it's not wilderness. There was no wilderness. Aboriginal people were intimate with every forest type, every range, every gully, intimate. And so there was no wilderness, there was no secret corner. Aboriginal people knew it all and were working to preserve it in a fashion that over 120,000 years they had developed intellectually, physically, the hard work involved, the burning regimes, the weeding, all of that. Aboriginal people had developed over 120,000 years, and people will get excited by the number 120,000 years because they'll say, no, the consensus among archaeologists is, well, when I went to school, it was 5,000 years. By the time I finished high school, it was 10. By the time I got to university, it was 40. By the time I left university, it was 45. And 3 years ago, it was 65. And then Jim Bowler, the great Jim Bowler, non-Aboriginal architect, comes up with a time of 120,000 years at Warrnambool. People laugh their socks off. You know, his life's work. They're laughing their socks off at him. Brother Jim, I do hope you live long enough to feel vindicated that your life's work is accepted by Australia. Because we do respect you. We do respect your relationship with the earth. And we want you not to die feeling shamed. I feel sorry for that old man. We should be able to talk about 120,000 years without having to pull the daggers out of our backs, without having to cringe, without having to apologise, because it's going to happen. And 10 years down the track, given the learning curve that I've seen in my lifetime, we'll be talking about 150,000 years by the end of next year. You know, that thing that turned up on the front page of the Australian, Rupert's magazine, that's been in the pipeline for 10 years. And we, Aboriginal people, have not been allowed to talk about that because it was embargoed by a university. We're not allowed to talk about our culture. And Joshy Gorringe, who worked on that site, my brother, I love you to death for your courage and your patience and your diplomacy, because you had to work with your own community, some of whom I know were sceptical. But you stuck it out, brother. I'm so proud of that. And I'm so proud of Michael Westaway and the others who put all that work in. So proud because of what you've done for your country, the mighty work you have done on behalf of your country. And that mighty work can be conducted by anonymous individuals pulling out Arum Lily, you know, a task which is incredibly difficult, getting rid of bridal creeper, but also it can be carried out by individuals talking to their neighbour and saying, did you know there used to be an orchid in Melbourne that covered the whole district and was used as Aboriginal food? And now we don't have that plant anymore. Why don't we have that plant anymore? Because that's a really good question. Because it goes back to how we treat Mother Earth. It says everything about our horrible attitude to Mother Earth. And Aboriginal people identified it on the second day of John Batman's arrival in Melbourne, what was to be called Bear Brass at one stage, and then Melbourne. Those people said to the black-skinned people in Batman's party, they said, why do you shit in the river? Because for them it was an outrage. It was a complete disregard for Mother Earth. I'm sorry to be sounding so lacking in hope, but it's not how I really feel. I've been thinking about yesterday's Australian and Rupert for 24 hours. And when you think about Rupert, you intend to take a bleak view of the world. But basically, I think this is an opportunity for us to reassess the invasion of Australia and what it means. Not just what it means for Aboriginal people, not just what it means for our dispossession and what might happen to us in the future and what might be offered to us in way of treaty, but what it means for Mother Earth. That's the woman I feel most strongly for in this. And it's not something that we should be proud of. You know, looking after Mother Earth is not something we should be proud of. We shouldn't feel superior to our neighbour with the roundup and the lawnmower, because in part it is our failure to talk to our neighbours, to promote an appreciation of Mother Earth. It is our failure. We can't sit back and be smug about all the idiots trying to destroy the green wedge, because they are our brothers and sisters. And if they still hate Mother Earth, despise her, discredit her, then in part it's our fault. And we have to work toward it. And it's my fault too. And one of the hardest things to do is to talk openly and warmly with someone you know is going to not believe you, someone who will maybe laugh in your face. That's really hard work. But that's the pick and shovel work that has to be done. We have to talk to people like Barnaby Joyce and Tony Abbott, because they're the ones we have to convince. And if we can't convince them, because they have the levers of power within their grasp, we will allow them to destroy Mother Earth. Anyway, Doug, over to you, mate.
Thanks, Bruce. We have got a couple of questions that have come in. First one is, are there practical steps we can take to encourage Indigenous plants, help re-establish what was there?
Yeah, grow them and look after them. And a lot of our plants need sunlight, and the forest that we have at the moment has too little sunlight reaching the forest floor. The old Aboriginal forest had, as a rule of thumb, 10 to 12 trees to the acre. They were massive trees. Every forest was different, and so that rule of thumb changes according to the forest. But in this country, Gippsland, an old grandfather friend of an old friend remembers riding a horse in a straight line between Bairnsdale and Sale, because you could, because you didn't have to deviate. You could ride a horse in a straight line because the trees were so big that you could ride beneath their branches and you wouldn't have to deviate because it was so open. And this is around the time of, 20 years after the colonial period. So sheep have already been involved, horses have already been involved. So the bush is starting to change shape. But because those old trees are still there, people can see to the horizon beneath them and ride a horse beneath them, walk in a straight line. Since the fires in this country here, we had a very open forest for 6 months. And beneath that, the branches of those trees that had survived, we saw an incredible influx of vanilla lily, bulbine lily, kangaroo grass, redleg, panicum, lavenode. All of these things were growing in the forest. They're gone now because the forest, the regrowth has overtaken them. The forest floor is now full of tobacco bush, hop gardenia. It's full of wattle, black wattle, hickory wattle, young eucalypts. And so all the grasses have gone. Now, the old people, old Aboriginal people, and these are not angels, these are not sages without sandals, these are just people. But the scheme had been developed over a very long time, and it was to introduce cool burn into that forest so that people could have food. Now we're promoting a system down here where we can have the forest and food at the same time, and it's anathema to most of my friends because they think the bush they grew up with as kids is the real bush. And I don't think we can sustain that bush, because the bomb that hit Monoculture came out of forestry operations and national park to our west. they had been cool burned by Aboriginal people for the last 150 years, say, then that fire could never have hit us like that. And so now, instead of responding to wanting a safer bush, what we do is we cut down every big tree. That's what's happening around Mallacoota now. We're cutting swathes of forest immediately after the fires, within days of the fires. I would meet people on the Wallagra Road with yellow vests, cutting down every big tree they could find because, you know, because they could get paid to do it. And they weren't axe murderers. It was what they were told to do, and they believed that it would be useful. We're so ignorant about our country. We're so disrespectful of Mother Earth, and we think it's science. It's crazy. And like I was saying before to you, the burden falls on you because you are in possession of the knowledge. But I would just say to people, we have to reorganise our forestry in Australia. We have to do it through our shires, our governments, and, you know, and that talk is hard. That talk is unrewarding, but you have to do it. And when you die, your kids will have to do it. And when they die, their kids will have to do it. We have to think long term, because this, I said to the young lads, you know, they're kids really. I look at them as kids. You know, they're 25, 35, 40-year-old people, and they're children. And I say to them, so you busted your guts for a week out here, and you got, you know, ash all over your shirt. You're absolutely knackered. You're looking forward to having a beer on a Friday night. And I said, you're going to have to do it for 70 years before you see a return on your work. So I'll be gone. You'll probably be gone. And your kids will inherit this work that you're doing. And they're the sort of things we have to do. It's heroic. You know, we can grow warrigal greens. We can grow bulbine lily and kangaroo grass. We can do all of those things. But we can't sit around half a dozen trays of Murnong tubers and think we've won. This is political. This is hugely political. And a lot of your friends will struggle to believe what you're doing, but this is our fate. Isn't it wonderful? What a joy.
Thanks, Bruce. That was reassuring insofar as here in Christmas Hills we are trying to help Wurundjeri reintroduce cool burning and to demonstrate what happens when you do, and trying to get more grasses is part of that. So we're doing that on a very small scale, but that's part of trying to get the word out and sort of show others what it might look like. So another question here. I've read of early settlers collecting and eating manna from manna gums as a treat. Have you come across this, and do you have any information about this?
Yeah, it's a little exudation on the leaf, and there's several different kinds of manna. Some of it is exuded by insects. Some of it is the leaf itself. Sometimes a leaf is punctured and an exudation takes place. Sometimes it's that exudation from you know, the backside of an insect, and it's delicious. In the Otways, we used to collect it off manna gum, thus named manna gum, and it's sweeter than sugar, but it's not sugar. It's very good. Diabetics can eat it until the cows come home. So manna gum is a wonderful thing, but your forest has to be in a condition to produce it. Not all trees produce it, but if you see it, it'll be on the track. And if you wet the tip of your finger and touch it, it will adhere to your finger. So you don't pick up gravel and sand. It's absolutely delightful. And Aboriginal people would collect baskets of it and take it back home, like having Friday night lollies. That's what we used to have when I was a kid, Friday night lollies. Never had them any other time. And So I imagine the old Aboriginal camps, you know, oh, look out, here comes Dad with the manna. Must be Friday night.
All right, there's another question here. How would you suggest improving soil quality to improve the growth of trees and native plants? And secondly, how would you suggest we persuade white contractors that we may work with to follow these cultural and ecological protocols that were followed by our old people?
Well, I'd get rid of sheep straight up, and I'd try to reduce the impact of vehicles. Vehicles make an incredible impact on the soil, even just a little old ute. So on the farm, we try to be really careful about where we drive, because that compaction is very serious for a lot of our plants, because they have grown up with Aboriginal tilth. The tilth of the Aboriginal soil was very light. The first settler said you could run your fingers through the soil. So if we compact our soil so that you can't do that, so trying to do it, you'll break your fingers, we've done something wrong. So the compaction of hard-hoofed animals is something to do with it, but it's also vehicles, and it's also leaving the forest floor nude. If we expose the soil without covering it with plants, then we're rendering the soil open to compaction. And I'm sounding very wise about the Aboriginal tilth, but we're really the very early stages of learning how to reintroduce that. But we've seen an incredible change since we got rid of cattle off this property, in the health of our soil and its friability, and the reintroduction of mosses. Because old farmers around Colac, when they first arrived after the invasion, they said that you could not walk through those paddocks without sinking up to your ankles and getting your socks wet with the dew. And it changed within months of sheep being introduced, compaction. But also it changed the microclimate, because all of those plants, the kangaroo grasses, the orchids, the lilies, they were growing through moss. You know, that's been documented by some of those early farmers. Some of those early farmers who wondered about the soil, wondered about this incredible productivity, and wondered to, you know, how they could sustain it. But they were ignorant that it was the sheep that were compacting the soil, but also eating the monong below its first leaf and thus killing it. A kangaroo can't do that. A kangaroo's dentition won't allow it to kill the plant. So there are a lot of things that we have to be aware of. You know, if it wasn't complicated, if it wasn't hard, then we're disrespecting Mother Earth. She's done something which has taken her millions of years. And, you know, the fact that we've been able to destroy it in a couple of hundred is no great credit to us. But if we think that our repair can be done in 5 years, or the term of a government, for instance, then I think we're fooling ourselves. This is a program that we have to look at that will, you know, occupy us for hundreds of years and forever. The repair will take 100 years. The maintenance will take us forever. But Aboriginal people had 120,000 years to know this country, to know what she needed, to know what to do to look after her. And so I think it would be wise of us to respect the longest lived civilization on Earth, and to look at how we might replicate those systems, not just to be kind to blackfellas, not just to be good greenies, hard, common economic sense. That's what it is. Because all that time of productivity, all that time of health, prosperity, all that time when a Canadian dentist comes over here and examines Aboriginal teeth and cannot find one cavity because of the health, because of the nutrition. So if a Canadian dentist can search the country for a cavity and not find one, something is right. Something is going right in the country. You know, Beth Gott, the lovely Beth Gott, who did all the early work on Murnong when no one else would do it, when, you know, men with leather elbow patches laughed at her for doing women's work. She was studying Murnong, and Beth wrote to me and said, oh yeah, what you're doing is all right, but you're saying there's a sugar in Murnong, it's fructans. And she said the importance of that is not just a chemical distinction and a quibble, because they're entirely different. Fructans can be eaten by a diabetic, a sugar can't, and the old people knew that. That's what old Beth said to me. Good
Thanks,
luck to
Bruce.
you, Beth. I
Yes.
know you're not well. I love you to death, sweetheart.
Yeah, and we've been very fortunate to have her out and come and talk to us as well, which was lovely. There's a few more questions coming in, and if we're going to fit some responses into the time we have available, we'll have to see if we can get through them. So I've got one here.
Sorry, Doug, can I interrupt for just a minute?
Sure.
I just saw one flash up on the screen, which was about eating kangaroos and becoming vegetarians. I think to eat kangaroos would be a wonderful thing because of the fact that they have so little fat, the fact that they don't destroy soil or plants. But in general terms, it would be great for us to eat less meat. Now, I'm speaking to you as one of the great carnivores, because that's what I grew up with as a kid. But I am trying to eat less meat because I know what impact meat animals are doing to our planet. We can't all afford to eat meat every day, and we have to take responsibility for it. Eating kangaroos is a sustainable way to go in this country, but we just can't eat the same amount of meat as we were off a sheep or a cow and then transfer that to a kangaroo. That's unsustainable. We have to treat meat as a luxury, like it was when I was a kid, an absolute luxury. But now we think we can eat it anytime we want. Now we think we can eat lollies anytime we want. Now we think we can drink beers anytime we want. My father's grandfather used to open a bottle of beer at the end of a working day, and he and his mate would have a glass each, and the glasses were that big. They were 5 ounces, and they would put the cap back on the bottle and put it back into the Coolgardie safe, and they would drink that rest of that bottle the next night. Now, if we haven't had 3 stubbies of beer, we don't think we've had a beer. You know, we eat to excess, we drink to excess, and we just expect this. We expect the earth to give it to us. And the poor old girl, she cannot. You know, and we set a very bad example to other nations. And we can see what has happened in Asia and Africa from the European example. We have to consume less.
Thanks, Bruce. I've got a question here that one of our audience has also provided a response to, but I'll ask it to you as well. I'm wondering if there's a way to provide the same benefits of cool burns to Indigenous plants grown in a backyard.
Yeah, because the cool burn is, as we're working with young Yuin people out there on the farm, and our instruction to them is the old people lit these fires in bare feet and walked through them. So if you can't do that with this fire, then it's too hot. And my son and I in the Otways practice this kind of burn where you lit it, you let it walk through the undergrowth, and you could walk through it. If you couldn't walk through it, it was too hot. And we just need to be really respectful of fire. And what is happening today, what they call a cool burn today, they drop incendiaries from the sky, and that's supposed to be a backburn. You know, how can that possibly look after Mother Earth? And the other thing about what the Aboriginal people of the past did, and we want to do today, is it's labour intensive. It's people on the ground. It's people in the forest. When I first came to Mallacoota, it was nothing. I was doing bird counts for what was in the forestry department. And it was nothing for me to sit down with another 15 people in the bush for a cup of tea. All of them were involved in forestry, and we all sat down together. There wasn't a division between us. You know, we were doing bird counts. No one called us a greenie. They said, do you want a cup of tea? And we didn't say to them, I'm not going to take a cup of tea from someone cutting down trees. You know, it was a different age, a gentler, more respectful age. But there'd be 15 of them. Now, when you go to a forestry operation, there's one person and 3 machines. And those machines are massive. Their wheels are higher than this ceiling, and they do enormous damage. And we, you know, the country towns around where I live are being told that it's the greenies robbing them of jobs. It's not the greenies, it's those big wheels. It's those machines that rob them of their jobs, because where there were 15 people doing their job, there's now 1 person and 3 machines. And we've been sold a pup in this country, and we've accepted it. You know, the Labor Party, the Greens, they have allowed industrial foresters to sell us this furphy, which becomes accepted. And I'll never, ever forget the last election when a good-hearted people went up to those coal mining districts and chanted in their streets about the dangers of coal without ever thinking about what would happen to those people if they lost their job, without ever coming up with a plan for them to have a job in a solar industry or something like that. If you take a job from someone, you've got to give them one back. And it's not hard, it's economic, you know, 101. We shouldn't be separating ourselves so much between humans that one group of humans can disdain the work of another group of humans and not want them to bring up their children with shoes and school books. And more or less that's what people up in northern Queensland thought was being said to them. They might have been wrong, but that was the perception they got. And we've got to be really careful of those perceptions. And I've got no idea why I've ranged into that subject, but there you go.
All right, thanks, Bruce. With all due respect to Andrea C, I might not pose that question because I suspect it could take a very long it could take wind you up, Bruce, and keep you going. So I'll let you know what it is, but we won't look for a response. It says, with regards to many of these issues being political, why do you think politicians, government are so reluctant? Ignorance, fear, embarrassment? That's the question. We'll hold off on a response, I think, just for the time being, and get through a couple of the other questions.
Sorry, Doug, I just saw it. I just saw another question come up about wet forests, and it's really important because when the Grampians were on fire about 7 or 8 years ago, people who were fighting those fires noticed they stopped in the gullies because that's where the wet mosses were. It's changed now because global warming and our own practices have meant that we now have hotter fires than we've ever had. So those wet gullies and those wet forests are burning. But mountain ash country and those wet gullies were probably never burnt by Aboriginal people, because their little cool burns would have burnt up to the edge of them and stopped. So I just saw that question. I can't remember your name, but it's a really important question. And, you know, having cool burns doesn't mean to say, sorry, my dog wants to talk to me. Having those cool burns doesn't mean that we burn every stick of country, every corner of country. It's horses for courses, and it's common sense. And I fear that too much enthusiasm, too much undirected enthusiasm can do a lot of damage with burning. And it's been done down here, so-called cool burns that begin a crown fire. It's not a cool burn. If you can't walk through it with bare feet, it's too hot.
Thank you. So I will go back up the list a little bit. It's fairly a long-winded one, but so we'll read it out. Robert has a question that is historical in nature. He references the Luniig cartoon of early white farmers in this country, where the man is using the woman as a plough, which is being dragged through the paddock by cockies. Who did the farming in traditional Aboriginal society? As far as I know, no animals, with the possible exception of dingoes, were kept for food. So the men would have always had to go hunting. In other early farming societies, because the women had been gatherers and knew the plants and cast seed and aerated the soil, they were the first farmers. How was the division of labour worked out? Who did what? How many hours each day did they work? And was farming seasonal or all year round?
Well, look, well, Aboriginal people did keep animals for food other than dingoes, but that's a long story. Division of labour in Aboriginal societies is something that needs an enormous amount of study, I think. We can talk, you know, and if you're not talking to Aboriginal people about that, then you're not serious about getting a decent answer. But I'm told that things like Murnong were women's business, but I don't think that's absolutely correct. I think families were interested in Murnong. Families were interested in the kangaroo grass. I think there was a lot more collective behaviour going on, and ethnographic observations of Aboriginal people with the big fella up the front with the spear and the women behind carrying all the gear. It might have been true for the observation of the European, but it probably wasn't true when they got home, when those people got home and divided the labour. I'm no expert on it, but from the study of, you know, my own community, other communities to which my family are related, friends of those families, I think it's a much more complex answer than I can give. I think it's a great answer. I will introduce a complexity that does worry me, that the day that Barangaroo gave birth, she was also beaten up by her husband, but she in turn beat up him. So, you know, Bennelong and Barangaroo had a dust up the day she gave birth to her. And, you know, we were working together with a group of Aboriginal people and we said, what's going on with that violence? You know, we can't ignore it. As Aboriginal people, we can't ignore it. It was obviously part of the culture, but was it provoked by the white arrangement or was it inherent? I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's really important. So division of labour, which is probably relevant to that observation I just made, is a really complex thing. But look, I think it was a more egalitarian society than a lot of white males thought. You know, I've spoken to old ladies in the up north, and they said said to me about these issues, about who did what work and who was violent and who wasn't, they said, look, we know what we're doing. We don't need your help. We can handle this. We've always handled it. And we're happy.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm going to jump to, there's a couple of questions here, which I think potentially I think makes sense to put them together. So it says, Bruce, what would you like to see Nillumbik Council, so that's the council that Christmas Hills falls within, Nillumbik Shire Council, what would you like to see them do as the #1 focus to help heal Mother Earth? So that's the question coming from council. And then related to that, we'd love to hear any suggestions you have on how community groups can work with council across all departments, including planning, economic development and culture, as well as environment.
Well, #1, talk to the Aboriginal community and not at the 11th hour. #2, speak politely and in a friendly manner to your enemies. And those enemies might be as thick as a brick. They might be the White Shoe Brigade, the people who want to cut up your green wedges. But speak to them politely and teach your children well and your grandchildren, because that conversation probably has to go for 3 generations.
And for community groups, any suggestions on how they can work with council across the different parts of that council has?
It's the same answer, Doug.
Same principle. Yep.
You know, the community groups are full of generosity, volunteerism, and love of the earth, but those groups have to have patience and they have to have love. You've got to love your enemy, because they might be doing really stupid things, but they're humans. And the only way we can succeed is as humans together. And that means education, that means change in social structure, and we can't do it if we're enemies. And that's why yesterday for me was such a great moment. If Rupert Murdoch's had on the front page a description of Aboriginal village life and trade, then anything is possible.
Thank you. Got another one here, quite specific. We were told that, I think it was supposed to be Whitefield in the King Valley, was named Whitefield because of fields of white plants which were there in the early days. Any idea if this could have been white orchids?
I would say it was, but it could have been a number of plants. But, you know, I'm guessing that it was the diurus. And, you know, there's a moth orchid too, which is also a diurus. And down in this country, near East Gippsland, the yellow orchid was a major source of food. And there's a little football ground near Fernbank, which is covered in this orchid. It was a major food plant. And luckily, the Fernbank Footy Club folded. And so we've got these orchids back now.
Thanks, Bruce. Another question, is there a symbiotic relationship between mosses and kangaroo grass and lilies?
I think there is. I think this is why, you know, people who are wanting to avoid these issues will laugh, because, you know, we're talking about harvesting lilies, murnong, kangaroo grass and orchids out of the same paddock. And, you know, in terms of industrial agriculture, it just sounds ridiculous. But I'm sure that's what the old people did. And I'm sure that's what we need to do. And I'm sure what it will lead to is fewer food miles, because people in their own backyard, in their own farm, will be able to harvest 7 or 8 crops and sell it on the corner of their street or their road or in the corner store, and make money out of it. The hard thing is to make sure that Aboriginal people are part of that resurgence of these plants. And I say that with enormous experience in this area, that all the goodwill in the world, often does not translate to involvement of Aboriginal people. That's why I said involve Aboriginal people, but not at the 11th hour, not when you want a black signature on a dotted line, because that's the way you're going to get your grant, or that's the way you're going to convince council. You have to be friends.
All right, I think there's one more that we'll probably make that the last as well. How long does it take to cultivate larger, more desirable native foods such as the murnongs that were once selectively bred?
Look, setting up the system on the farm is, I've been growing Monong for 7 years now. I'm learning more about it all the time, but I'm still ignorant. On the farm, we've been growing for 3 years. We're nowhere near, you know, our knowledge base would be 15% at best of the old peoples. So we just have to keep plugging away. But I think we just have to try. We have to keep trying these things and learning, because that's how these things were utilised in the first place. I could send you a packet of Monong seed now. You could sow it next March and April and you'd get Monong straight away. But how do you get that as a sustainable plant? Because the old people weren't pulling that plant out of the ground. They were lifting it and selecting tubers off it, because that plant was perennial. It had to stay in the ground with its root structure and its association with the fungi, and all the little plants and the bee that pollinates it, which is not actually a bee at all. We have to re-establish that whole pattern. And so you can grow a plant easily, but how can you grow a plantation? That's what we're working with at the moment. And it just takes a long time and a lot of love.
And as I was saying, that's be the last question. I think one was in the midst of being typed, so we will ask that one. Do you think farmers would not have problems with the mice plague if they did not have a large monoculture but still had good biodiversity?
Yeah, I think monoculture produces mono mouse, and I think that you know, if we had a more diverse ecology, that we wouldn't have those plagues. You know, whether they be locusts or mice, or cockatoos for that matter.
All right, look, thank you, Bruce. I think we'll close off the questions there. Before we finish, I just want to give a plug for the Great Southern Bio Blitz, which is a 4-day citizen science event for the entire Southern Hemisphere that both Nillumbik Council and the Christmas Hills Landcare Group are participating in. And you can contribute, you can contribute simply by loading your observations of native plants, animals and fungi on the iNaturalist platform between Friday the 22nd and Monday the 25th of October. In the lead up, you can get the iNaturalist app on your phone and start making observations now so that you are familiar with how it works come Bio Blitz time. There's more information available on the Nillumbik Council events web pages. And I just wanted to add, I think it is, it's one way of helping you better know your country by going out and looking and discovering. And by sharing it through iNaturalist, people online can tell you what you've found if you don't know what it is. So, in closing, I'd like to thank Bruce. I'd like to thank Nillumbik Council and you, the audience, with both your interests and all your questions, for making this what I believe has been a successful event. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed.